Today we're going to talk about boxes, and the text for our message is taken from Matthew chapter 17, verses 1 through 8. Matthew chapter 17, verses 1 through 8. Now after 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and John his brother, led them up on a high mountain by themselves, and he was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as light. And behold, Moses and Elijah appeared to them, talking with them. Then Peter answered and said to Jesus, "Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, let us make here 3 tabernacles, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." While he was still speaking, behold, a bright cloud overshadowed them, and suddenly a voice came out of the cloud saying, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Hear him." And when the disciples heard it, they fell on their faces and were greatly afraid. But Jesus came and touched them and said, "Arise and do not be afraid." When they had lifted up their eyes, they saw no one but Jesus only. As I mentioned to you, boxes have a tendency of bringing this wonderful order to our lives. They keep cereal from spilling out of boxes, and they keep books from tumbling out in an area where we're trying to contain them. So when it comes to containing stuff, boxes are great. But when it comes to explaining people, they're not that much good. And when it comes to defining Christ, there's not a single box that works. His contemporaries tried, mind you. They designed a whole lot of boxes to try and define Jesus Christ. But he never fit in one. For instance, they called him a revolutionary, but then he turned around and he paid taxes. They labeled him as a country carpenter, but he confused the scholars among them. He defied easy definitions. He was a Jew who attracted Gentiles. He was a rabbi who eventually gave up on the synagogues. He was a holy man who hung out with streetwalkers and turncoats. In a male-dominated society, he recruited females. In an anti-Roman culture, he didn't even begin to denounce Rome. He talked like a king, and yet Jesus lived a lot like a pilgrim. People tried to box him in. They couldn't then, but we still try to do that today. Kind of like the taxi driver who keeps a miniature Jesus superglued to the dashboard of his taxi, so that anytime he needs a parking space or a green light, he rubs his plastic, "Oh, do me a favor, Jesus." Or the midnight televangelist who assures me that prosperity is only a prayer away. Just ask the "make me a buck" Jesus. Christ, sometimes reduced to a handful of doctrines, becomes a recipe for which we've got all the ingredients. And if you just mix them together correctly, then the Jesus of my making appears. Politicians, they pull box-sized versions of Jesus off the shelf as well, asserting that Jesus would most certainly vote green or he'd be conservative. The Jesus of my politics comes in handy during elections, especially this time of year. These are all box-sized gods, and you'll find them in the very tight grip of people who prefer a God that they can manage, a God that they can control and predict. And in this topsy-turvy life in which we all live, doesn't it kind of require a tame deity? I mean, in a world that's out of control, we need a God that we can control. A comforting presence, kind of like a lap dog or a kitchen cat. We call and he comes. or we pet and he purrs. And Peter, James, and John, in the text that we've been discussing this morning, must have tried to do the same thing with Jesus. Because otherwise, how do you begin to explain the box-blowing expedition that Jesus took them up the Mount of Transfiguration to see? It seems like the high points of Scripture occur on the high points of earth. Let me give you some examples. Abraham offering Isaac on Mount Moriah. Moses witnessing the burning bush on Mount Sinai. Elijah ascending to heaven from Mount Horeb. Christ redeeming humanity on a hill called Calvary. Now, no one knows for sure, but most historians place this Mount of Transfiguration example and this story on a 9,200-foot tall mountain called Mount Hermon. It towers over northern Israel and its landscape, and in fact, it can be seen from the Dead Sea, which is over 100 miles away. This gigantic, snowy peak was the perfect place for Christ to retreat with Peter, James, and John. It was a time where Jesus could get away with his disciples, away from kind of the nagging crowds and controversies that constantly surrounded him. Jesus now, in this particular location and at this particular time, could actually have the undivided attention of his three closest friends. In fact, it was there that they could pray. And it says in Luke chapter 9, verse 28, he, referring to Jesus, took Peter, John, and James and went up on the mountain to pray. Now, at some point while praying, this gentle carpenter erupts into a cosmic figure of light. Matthew 17:2 says, he was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as light. And since we weren't there, we can only imagine, but from what I see in my mind's eye, it's like light is just completely spilling out of Jesus. I mean, it's a brilliant light. It's an explosive light. It's shocking. Brightness is pouring through every pore of his skin and stitch of his robing. Jesus is on fire. And Mark wants us to know that Jesus' clothes shimmered, glistening white, whiter than any bleach could make them. That's what Mark said in chapter 9, verse 3. But this particular radiance that we are observing related to Jesus doesn't have anything to do with a really good laundromat. It was the presence of God. And Scripture habitually equates God with light, right? And light with holiness. For instance, in 1 John chapter 1, verse 5, John writes, God is light. In him there is no darkness at all. Paul, or Timothy, writing in 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 16, he dwells in unapproachable light. The transfigured Christ, then, is Christ in his purest, holiest form. It's as if he's a diamond with absolutely no flaw, or a rose petal with absolutely no bruising, or a song that is in perfect pitch, and a poem that has some sort of impeccable rhyme. Peter, James, and John had never seen Jesus like this before. I mean, they'd seen him walk on water. They'd seen him multiply bread. They'd seen him talk to the wind or banish demons or raise the dead. They've seen Jesus do all of those things. But here, a standing torch, they have never seen Christ in that capacity ever. And it turns out that Jesus was just getting warmed up because all of a sudden, two visitors show up. Moses and Elijah, the giver of the law and the prince of the prophets, apparently stepped through a thin veil that separates earth from paradise. And Moses and Elijah were like the Washington and Lincoln of their time. I mean, their portraits hung in the entryway of the Hebrew Hall of Fame. And here they stood. About this point in time, Peter then clears his throat to speak. And behold, Moses and Elijah appeared to them talking with him. Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will make 3 tabernacles here, one for you and one for Moses and one for Elijah." Unfortunately for Peter, fire on the mountain turned his foot into his mouth. Because these words, they might seem harmless enough, in fact, even a good idea to some, because we like to memorialize events, don't we? I mean, we like to build statues and tablets and monuments. That's what we do for people that we want to revere and think about in terms of history going forward. Peter thinks that this particular event deserves a special building program, and Peter himself volunteers to be at the head of the committee to build the tabernacles for Jesus, Moses, and Elijah. He thinks it's a terrific idea. But God didn't. That wasn't his perspective. Peter's idea of 3 tabernacles was so off base from God's perspective and so inappropriate that God wouldn't even permit him to finish the sentence. Because look at verse 5. While he, Peter, was still speaking, behold, a bright cloud overshadowed them, and suddenly a voice came out of the cloud saying, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Hear him." Peter must have missed that point. You see, Peter had placed Jesus Christ in this very respectable box labeled the Great Men of History box. He wanted to give Jesus and Moses and Elijah equal honor. But God wasn't going to have it. And Peter, James, and John didn't speak anymore. No more talk of building programs, no discussion of basilicas or tabernacles or memorials or some sort of building. They saw what no other person had ever seen: Christ in his cosmic greatness. And words don't work in moments like those. Apparently, the blood was draining from their faces. Their skin was probably turning ashen color. Their knees are wobbling and their pulse is racing. And verse 6 says, they fell on their faces and were greatly afraid. Wouldn't you be? Here you are standing on a mountaintop with a person that you know to be Jesus, who is a good friend of yours, has been a great teacher, has done some really crazy stuff with nature, done all sorts of miracles. But now, in this moment in time, he's turned into something you have never seen before. So bright you can barely see it and understand it and grasp it. And then you see Moses and Elijah. Now, how Peter, James, and John knew it was Moses and Elijah, I don't know. But apparently there was something about their appearance that Peter, James, and John just immediately knew it was these two individuals. And now, based upon their experience, look, you've got Jesus, Moses, and Elijah. Wow, it's great to be here. Let me build a temple to all three of you. And out of the middle of that sentence, God says, no. He says, this is my beloved Son in whom I'm well pleased. Who should you listen to? Hear him. So now all of a sudden, fire on the mountain leads to fear on the mountain. A holy, healthy fear. Peter, James, and John experienced some sort of fortifying terror, a stabilizing reverence in their life to the one and only true God. They encountered at that moment the person who had flung the stars out in the sky like throwing diamonds onto velvet, who whisked prophets away in chariots, who left the Pharaoh bobbing in the Red Sea. They were gripped deeply in their gut that this person, God, was at once everywhere and right here. The very sight of the glowing Galilean probably sucked all the air and arrogance out of them, leaving them appropriately prostrate on the ground, face first on the ground. That is the fear of the Lord. And I want to let you know that there is absolutely nothing neurotic about fearing God. In fact, the neurotic thing is to not be afraid or afraid of the wrong thing. That is why God chooses to be known by us, so that we stop being afraid of the wrong thing. When God is fully revealed, and we get it, like Peter, James, and John obviously experienced, then we experience that same conversion of fear. Fear of the Lord is the deeply sane recognition that we are not God. And how long has it been since you've had a fresh understanding of Christ? An experience with Him that buckles your knees or empties your lungs? How long has it been for you and for me since a glimpse of Him has left us speechless or breathless? If it's been a while for you, that may explain your fears. Because as our awe of Jesus expands, fears of life diminish. A big God translates into big courage, but a small view of God generates no courage at all. A small view of God is this limp, kind of puny, fireless Jesus, which then would have absolutely no power over cancer cells, let's say, or corruption, or identity theft, or stock market crashes, or global calamities. A packageable, portable Jesus might fit well in your purse or on the shelf at home, but that does nothing to address your fears. And maybe that's why Jesus took the disciples up the mountain, because He was beginning to see the box into which they were trying to confine Him. And Jesus saw the future that awaited these same disciples. He would see the fireside denial of Peter. He would see the prisons of Jerusalem and Rome. He would see the demands of the church and the persecutions of Nero to follow. A boxed-sized version of God simply wouldn't work for the disciples. They needed to have a bigger view of God. They needed to have a transcendent view of God, because Jesus knew that lying ahead of them were the kinds of fears that without a big God, you would just collapse and die. So if that's true for them, then don't maybe we need to know the transfigured Christ as well? The one who spits holy fire, one who convenes and commands historical figures, who occupies the loftiest perch and wears the only true crown of the universe, God's beloved Son. One who takes His friends to Mount Hermon's peak so that they can kind of get a peek into heaven. In the book Prince Caspian, Lucy sees Aslan, the lion. And for the first time, she sees him now in many years. And he's changed since their last meeting. And his size surprises her. And so she tells him as much. Aslan, said Lucy, you're bigger. That is because you are older, little one, answered he. Not because you are, I am not. But every year you grow, you will find me bigger. And it's the same way with Jesus Christ. The longer we live in him, the greater he becomes in us. It's not that he changes, it's because we do. We see more of him. We see dimensions and aspects and characteristics of Christ that as we mature and grow, we have never ever seen before. Increasing and astonishing increments of his purity and his power and his utter uniqueness. We discard the boxes and old images of Christ like used tissues at that point. We don't dare place Jesus on a political donkey or elephant. We don't define Jesus with a doctrine or confine him to an opinion. Because the truth is, we'd more easily swallow the ocean than capture Christ in a box. And in the end, we respond just like the disciples. Because at that point, we too fall on our faces and worship him. And when we do, the carpenter says, "Arise and do not be afraid." So here's my hunch, church. Peter, James, and John descended the mountain, sunburned and smiling, probably with a spring in their step, maybe even a little swagger to their step. I mean, with a Messiah like this one, who could hurt them, right? And here's another hunch. Mount Hermon is still ablaze and has space for us as its guests. I want to challenge you this week to try and find the Jesus that you worship, the God that we worship. Find him in places you would never think to find him. Look for him in places and in ways that you would never hope to think you would find him. Because too often I think we try and put this God that we worship into a box and eliminate our ability to transcend it. And when we easily put God into this box that we've defined, then we can just put him on the shelf and bring him out when we need to. So we put him on the shelf Monday through Saturday. Oh, let me take God off the box. Let me bring him with me in my pocket. We'll go worship on Sunday. And then when I go back home, I put him back on my shelf until the next Sunday. Because it's convenient. It fits in your pocket. It fits in your wallet. It fits in your purse. But what about seeing God in a very transcendent way like these disciples did? See him in a way that just blows your mind. See him in a way that, wow, the God that I worship can cure cancer or can help me and will answer my prayers and will save my soul. What if you see him from that perspective? Isn't that a God you want to stay in touch with more than just on a Sunday? I mean, if this is the God that showed up and created the worlds and yet brings his best friends to a mountaintop to give them a peek into heaven and give them strength for what he knows they're going to anticipate, isn't that the God you want to know too? Or has he changed? Sometimes I think we think as Christians that, well, that was 2,000 years ago. That was the New Testament. God is different. Well, tell me, how? How is God any different than the God we see in the New Testament? And how is God any different than the God we see in the Old? A God who can part the Red Seas? A God who can create earthquakes? A God who can raise people from the dead? Has he changed? And if he hasn't, have you? Have you been transformed by a God that just grips your soul and your life to the point where you just fall down and worship him? That's the God that we should be worshiping. Not one that we can easily define, not one that we can easily confine, but a God that permeates every aspect of our life, that deserves our praise, that deserves our worship, that deserves our gratitude. Try this week to find that God. Look for him in places that you might not expected to have seen him. Find that God who just touches your soul in a way that you've never been touched before, and then fall down in worship and praise. That's the God that wants to be known. That's the God who created the world, who created you for a purpose. As we know from Scripture, he created you and knew you before you were even conceived, much less born. And if that's true, he knows you pretty well. And I think that the image that God has created is one that he sees, and one that over time, with maybe some wisdom and some education, some experience, we begin to understand. I don't think we immediately know what we were created for or even why, and yet over time, God reveals to us through his word and experiences who he has created us to be. I've used the analogy before, but I'll use it this time. When they asked Michelangelo how he could create and craft these beautiful statues, his answer was very simple. He said, I see the image within the block, and I just simply chip away everything to reveal the image that I see. And sometimes I think that's us as human beings. God sees the image he's created us to be, and through life's experiences, chips away the stuff that fails to reveal that image. And like with any artwork, it takes time. It's not something you just get instantaneously. A little chip here, a little sanding here, a little sawing here, a little smoothing, polishing there. It's a process, but it's one in which the God of the universe is engaged in your life at a level that I'm just challenging you to engage him in a way that you haven't before in the past. I think our PowerPoint is not working. Or is the song up? Okay, there we go. We're going to sing this song, Trust and Obey. And I think it's appropriate for this particular message, because if you are committed to trusting and to obeying, I think it helps then give you the experience that we've been talking about, to take this God out of a box, that this is a God you can trust, this is a God you can obey, because he created you and knows you, and is taking you to a place to be with him forever. Along that journey is the chipping away process, the maturing process, the revealing the image process. And I think this song talks about that. So let's stand and let's sing.